And then the hijacker, Omar Mohammed, took off his mask and pretended that he was a passenger and that he was a victim. And in all of this confusion, the hijacker was actually taken to St. Luke's Hospital. A big question that surrounded the hijacking was how these terrorists were able to get their weapons onto the plane. The hijackers then informed the control tower that they would be killing a passenger in the next 15 minutes. And then every 15 minutes after that, they'd kill one more person. This is Humans. True stories about the most intriguing parts of human life. The good, the bad, and the downright horrific. Just before we get into this story today, I wanted to say that I tried to find the names of all the victims. So when I talk about a specific victim, I can actually give you their name. But I found that incredibly difficult, and lots of the sources that I am using today use terms like the Israeli woman, for example. So if I use that term, please know that I did try and find the correct name for this person. And this happens a number of times, but unfortunately, the information's just not out there. Saturday, the 23rd of November, was a fairly mild day in Athens, in Greece. And by nightfall, it was considered a fairly pleasant evening. 92 passengers made their way through 4 separate security checks before heading onto the Boeing 737-200 airliner headed for Cairo in Egypt. They were welcomed on board by each of the 6 crew members, and one by one they came on and they got a hello, how are you? And they were also greeted by 39-year-old Captain Hani Galal. Once everyone was on board, the crew made sure all of the passengers were in their seats and their seatbelts were on so that they could be ready for their 9 p.m. takeoff. This was 1985, so planes worked very differently then in terms of what was allowed on board. There was a smoking area at the back of the plane, and each flight attendant would make their way through offering newspapers to anyone who would want one. The plane sped forwards, and within 10 minutes, it had reached its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. Now, as this was happening, 3 seemingly normal passengers got up out of their seat and they pulled up their masks, and it was clear to the flight attendants and everyone on board that they were here to make trouble. And they quickly ambushed the flight attendants. Omar, Mohammed Ali Razak, and Nar al-Din Bu and Salem Chakori showed the flight attendants and all of the passengers on board that they did have guns and explosives on them. Omar Mohammed made his way straight to the front of the plane and forced his way into the cockpit. The other 2 hijackers, Nar and Salem, made their way through the plane, shouting at people not to move and demanding they hand over their passport. Fearing what might happen to them, each passenger that was approached did hand over their passports, and Salem took one end of the plane while Nar took the other. Some passengers were frisked and some weren't. There was really no rhyme or reason to how they were making their way through the passengers. They just knew that they wanted their passports. Salem told the passengers he was going to be sorting them by nationality. So he first brought 2 Israeli women to the front of the plane, Tamar Artzi and Nitzan Mendelssohn. And then he brought 3 Americans to the front of the plane, Scott Patrick Baker, Scarlett Rogenkamps, and Jackie Flug. He then ordered them all to sit down. He then signalled for the next 11 people to sit at the back of the plane, and they were all sorted because they were Palestinian, and he said that they would likely be no threat, and they were mostly women and children. So the plane had set off at around 9 p.m, and at this point it's coming up to 10 p.m, and the 2 hijackers are still frisking people just whenever they feel like it. And eventually, one of the hijackers makes his way to this Egyptian man and tells him to hand over his passport. The hijacker, Salem, asked this man, who he obviously didn't know at the time, Mustafa Medhat Kamal, to hand over his passport. And what Salem didn't know was that Mustafa was actually a in-flight Sky Marshal, essentially an in-flight security guard. And so when he went to reach for his passport, he actually got his gun and he immediately shot and killed Salem. But on hearing this shot, obviously the other 2 hijackers were extremely worried. This wasn't the plan at this point. And the hijacker Omar Mohammed, who was in the cockpit, came out and immediately started opening fire. At the same time, the other hijacker, Nar, who was at the back end of the plane, also opened fire. Altogether, a total of 19 shots were fired between both of the hijackers and the Sky Marshal's gun. And unfortunately, of course, there were a number of serious injuries at this point, both of passengers and of flight attendants, but not of the hijackers. Mustafa, our hero Sky Marshal, was actually shot in the back by Nar, who was the hijacker at the back of the plane, and Mustafa falls forward and slumps onto the floor. At this point, the two remaining hijackers shouted for everyone to be quiet and not to move, and that they didn't want to hurt anybody. Now, obviously, moments before this, there had been a number of guns shooting bullets in a plane, and there was serious concern about what might actually happen to the plane itself. Thankfully, because Mustafa's gun was purpose-built, it actually held 9mm hollow bullets, so they absolutely could kill if necessary at point-blank range, but they weren't going to actually damage the aeroplane itself. And obviously, the hijackers' guns were not purpose-built, so their bullets did puncture parts of the plane. There were 2 shots that pierced the side of the plane, and this led to a loss in compression, which was extremely dangerous. Captain Galal, who was obviously aware of what was happening at this point, was forced to bring the plane down to 10,000 feet due to lack of oxygen. And at this point, oxygen masks would have fallen down and passengers would have put them over their faces where possible. The hijacker Omar Mohammed, who had originally been in the cockpit, was now forced to take over. He was forced to take charge because their original leader, Salem, had obviously been shot and killed. He told Captain Galal to fly to Libya, but the issue was that with a plane flying so low at just 10,000 feet, a lot more fuel is burned. And the captain said that there was no way that they'd be able to get there on the amount of fuel that they had in the tank. The captain then tried to convince the hijackers to let them land at a US air embassy in Sicily. Obviously, they rejected this idea, but eventually they did agree on Malta. When they initially made contact with Malta to get permission to land on the air runway, they were actually denied permission. So Captain Galal had to say, if you don't let us land, we will literally have to abandon this aircraft in the sea. And obviously on hearing that, they did grant him permission to land there. And so they begin to make their descent, and eventually they do land safely on the airway in Malta. And news of the hijacking at this point had already travelled fast. And so the Maltese Prime Minister had already travelled across to the control room to try and begin negotiations or get himself ready for that. And he also called in the Maltese authorities to surround the plane. Weirdly, there was a level of optimism by Maltese authorities at this point, because 12 years earlier in 1973, there had been a similar hijacking with 3 hijackers on a plane that was travelling from Amsterdam to Tokyo, and it had 264 passengers on board. And somehow they'd actually managed to do negotiations so that no one was hurt and everyone was let off of the plane safely. So the Prime Minister of Malta, along with an interpreter, was in the control room waiting to make these negotiations. And then they got their first 2 demands off of the hijackers. The first was that they would need the Maltese authorities to leave from by the plane, and they also wanted a huge amount of fuel. But the Prime Minister refused these demands and said that he would only give them those things if they let all of the passengers off of the plane. And little did the hijackers know at this point that Captain Galal had actually done some unspecified techniques to ensure that that aeroplane wasn't going to be able to fly again. And so obviously the hijackers didn't know it, but they would not be leaving on that plane out of that runway. There was no escape. The hijackers then made their next demand. They said they needed a doctor to come into the plane to look at their friend, who was the other hijacker who had been shot. It wasn't clear to them that he had been killed at this point. They didn't know if he was past saving or not. A Maltese doctor called Victor immediately agreed to go on board into this potentially fatal situation, but he didn't care. He wanted to go and help the people, and knew that once he'd helped the potentially alive third hijacker, he would be able to convince the other hijackers to let him take a look at anyone else who was injured. And thankfully, after this, Captain Galal actually managed to convince the hijackers to let 2 flight attendants and 11 passengers off of the plane. Right now, the Prime Minister and the Maltese authorities and the people on board were really thinking that this hijacking could end up like the one 12 years earlier, where most of the people on board would get out without losing their lives or without being injured. But just then, a hijacker dumps a body off of the plane and onto the runway down below. It was the body of an Israeli woman who had been shot and killed in the shootout earlier. The hijackers then make another demand and they ask again for fuel. And this is the 3rd time that they've asked for fuel. And again, the Maltese Prime Minister says there's no way they're getting fuel until they release all of the passengers off of the plane. The Prime Minister then decided to bring on board the Egypt Special Forces counter-terrorism team. And he knew this was a risk. There was sort of it was known that they sometimes took things into their own hands and they wouldn't wait for instruction. But the Prime Minister informed them that they could only be involved in this operation if they listened to him and he would have the last word. He told them they must wait for his instruction. Egypt Special Forces were flown in to stand by some American soldiers, and they all agreed that on the morning of the 25th, they would disguise themselves as food caterers, and then they would storm the plane and they would get the passengers to safety. While this is all going on, all this planning is happening, on board the plane, the hijacker Omar Mohammed actually begins gathering people. He gathers a number of Filipino women and Egyptian women and begins actually allowing them off the plane. He then calls forward an Israeli woman. It's Tamar Artsy, who had been the woman who was taken to the front of the plane at the beginning of this story. And he opens the door and he lets her off. And as she gets to the top of the stairs, she suddenly feels this sharp shooting pain in the back of her head and neck. And she realises that he was never going to let her go. And so when she did fall down, Omar Mohammed went to her. She was sort of in the doorway of the plane at this point, and he shoved her down onto the runway below. The hijackers then informed the control tower that they would be killing a passenger in the next 15 minutes. And then every 15 minutes after that, they'd kill one more person. So 15 minutes later, with no sign of fuel or any sort of negotiations happening, Omar Mohammed calls forward the other Israeli woman, Nitzan Mendelsohn, and he says to her, walk forward, go, keep going. And she gets to the front of the plane where the door is, and she knows what's about to happen. The hijacker, Omar Mohammed, did shoot her in the head, and she fell down the stairs and on top of Tamar. And at this point, Tamar actually moved slightly, and the hijacker saw this and went down the stairs and shot her again. Over the next hour, he shot 3 more people, and they were all American. The first was a man called Scott Patrick Baker, and he was 6'5". So the hijacker actually had to raise his gun upwards to shoot him. The next American to be shot was Scarlett ROGENKAMS, and then the third American to be shot was Jackie Flug. During this time, the hijackers were making jokes at the people on board who were begging for mercy. Over the following few hours, they dumped the bodies of the people on board that they've shot. And also during this time, the doctor, Victor, who had gone in, had actually declared that that third hijacker, Salem, was in fact dead. At about 3 a.m, Maltese security officers began storming towards the plane. And the hijackers did see this, but they fired a warning shot, but there were only 2 of them. So they can't afford at this point to take their focus off of the passengers for too long. So they sort of just let it happen. They're not going to let them come onto the plane, but they sort of have to accept the fact that they're going to be around the plane area. And that warning shot obviously didn't stop the officers coming in. And what they were doing, their purpose wasn't to storm the plane at this point. Their purpose was to bring back the bodies of the dead. And so they started collecting and gathering these bodies and bringing them back as best they could. But by some way of a miracle, not everyone who had been shot and thrown onto that runway was dead. The Egyptian Sky Marshal who had been shot in the back and slumped down onto the floor and then thrown out onto the runway was actually still alive. And there were other survivors. The first Israeli woman to be shot after the "I'm going to kill someone every 15 minutes" threat, Tamar, was actually still alive, as were two of the Americans, Patrick and Jackie. Unfortunately, the other American woman, Scarlett, did die immediately after she was shot. And the other Israeli woman, Nitzan, although she initially did survive the shooting, she actually died a week later in hospital. At 8:15 p.m, so about 24 hours after the passengers and hijackers had boarded the plane, Captain Galal noticed on his dashboard that there was a red light that indicated that the cargo door was open, and he knew that a raid was about to begin. He tried to distract the hijackers, but a huge explosion went off and they went immediately to go and investigate what it was. The explosives that were used were actually far too much, and this had all been done against the Prime Minister's orders. As far as he was aware, they were going to storm the plane the following morning. Because of the sheer amount of explosive used, it actually fueled a fire that engulfed the entire top section of the plane, and that actually let out toxic fumes that intoxicated 54 people. The innocent co-pilot had actually managed to escape out of the cockpit, but as he did so, he was shot dead by the Egypt Special Forces unit. When the hijackers realised what was happening, one of them actually shot at Captain Galal, but fortunately the bullet just grazed his head and he was okay. During this time, the hijackers also let off a number of grenades that obviously injured and killed many of the passengers on board. On one opening of the plane, the new lead hijacker, Omar Mohammed, actually threw a grenade down towards 4 soldiers that were trying to make their way on board, and he injured them so badly that one of the men had to have 2 of his legs amputated and the other 3 were hospitalised immediately. And then the hijacker, Omar Mohammed, took off his mask and pretended that he was a passenger and that he was a victim. And in all of this confusion and the fact that the raid was not well organised and was not even agreed to by the Prime Minister who was giving the orders at the time, the hijacker was actually taken to St. Luke's Hospital. Fortunately, it quickly became clear that Omar Mohammed was not on the plane. He had not been killed, but he must have gone somewhere. So they thought the only place he could have ended up was the hospital. When the bus carrying the victims arrived at the hospital, 4 Egypt Special Forces soldiers jumped out ahead in front of it and demanded everyone get out. They said that if they didn't get what they wanted, they would blow up the intensive care unit. In their heads, they didn't care about how many people they hurt or killed. They just wanted Omar Mohammed. Thankfully, a police officer who knew Arabic spoke to these soldiers and said that Omar Mohammed was not on this particular bus and he must have been on the earlier one, which meant he must already be inside the hospital. And this was true. He was already inside the hospital being operated on. The Special Forces unit got word from some of the other people who were already in the hospital that they had recognised Omar Mohammed and they pointed out where he was. He was immediately arrested and taken into custody. Meanwhile, back at the site of the aeroplane wreckage, an investigation had begun. Firefighters began to remove the bodies of the dead and they placed them all in an area nearby the airport. And over the next few hours and days, family members would come and try and identify their loved ones. The first woman to go in and search through the bodies let out a blood-curdling scream. She had just come face to face with the dead body of her son and she couldn't process it, she couldn't cope. The investigation process continued, and at this point, forensic teams actually moved into the plane to try and gather some sort of sense of what had gone on there. Meanwhile, Omar Mohammed faced trial in Malta, but at this point in time, there were no anti-terrorism laws effective, so they had to try him on other charges. And because of this, the terrorist was actually only sentenced to 25 years in prison, but he was released in 8. It's probably useful at this point just to talk a little bit about the militant group that Omar Mohammed and the other 2 hijackers were a part of. The Abu Nidal organisation was named after its founder, Abu Nidal, and it was not connected to any religious or spiritual matters. It was an anti-Western group, but it wasn't particularly associated with any particular ideologies. The group carried out hijackings and assassinations and abductions of diplomats and attacks on synagogues, a total of 90 between 1974 and 1992. Just a few weeks after this hijacking, the group actually claimed responsibility for the Rome and Vienna airport attacks. The issue was that at the time, Malta had really strict laws on trying a person twice on charges connected to the same series of events. So they wouldn't cooperate with the US in deporting Omar Mohammed, but he was forced to leave Malta and he made his way to Ghana, where he was immediately arrested and taken into prison. And when he was eventually released in Ghana, he made his way to Nigeria. But he got on that flight to Nigeria and they wouldn't actually let him in the country. Instead, they handed him over to the FBI and the FBI took him to the US, where he faced a single charge of piracy and he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in Illinois. A big question that surrounded the hijacking was how these terrorists were able to get their weapons onto the plane. We know that they were subjected to 4 separate security checks before boarding the plane, but private security experts had previously assessed that although Athens Airport had the necessary equipment, government security personnel were not properly motivated or lacked proper training and weren't able to perform because of poor procedures. This might be why we only know of one Sky Marshal who was on board that day, when actually at the time they were required to have 4 Sky Marshals on board. And it was discovered that at the time, a number of international aviation organisations had actually been on at the Greek government to enhance security at their airports. Medical examiners concluded that 8 passengers were killed by the Egyptian Special Forces. The people on board the plane were of all ages and nationalities. There was one 10-year-old boy and there were 2 pregnant women who were also killed. Up until 9/11, the hijacking of aircraft 648 was the most fatal hijacking of an aircraft ever. And of course, there were a few survivors in this case, but ironically, because of the hijackers' guns and the fact that they'd made their own bullets and so they were defective, you were statistically more likely to survive being shot by one of the hijackers and then thrown out of the plane than if you were alive and on the plane when the raid took place by the Egypt Special Forces unit. The American woman, Jackie Flug, who did survive being shot and thrown onto that runway down below, was lying there for 5 hours before she was rescued. And during that time, she was replaying the last 12 hours of her life, potentially, in her head. The fact that she was excited for Thanksgiving weekend, the fact that she was marched to the front of that plane with 4 other passengers, knowing what likely her fate would be. On the walk forward to the front of that plane, she prayed and she said her goodbyes in her head. She stood at the top of the stairs waiting for the inevitable, and then she felt this horrific pressure in her ears and she fell forwards onto the runway below. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she realised that she was still alive and she knew she had to stay absolutely still, because if she didn't and if Omar Mohammed saw her move, she knew that he wouldn't hesitate to come down those stairs and shoot her again. 5 hours later, she felt her body being dragged about 30 metres towards a vehicle, and once she reached the ambulance, she turned her head and asked, "Are you the good guys or the bad guys?" The ambulance crew were obviously completely shocked and rushed her immediately to hospital, where she was taken into surgery, and doctors worked to remove the bullet and bone splinters from near her brain. Doctors managed to save Jackie's life, but the next few weeks and months and years proved incredibly challenging and difficult for her. The remaining bone splinters that were lodged near her spine and brain made life incredibly challenging, and she would have to learn to live with partial sight and epilepsy. She was back and forth between various medical professionals, but when her medical coverage ran out, she was told there was little else they could do for her. She was obviously incredibly disappointed and angry about this. And one day she sat down and she actually wrote a letter to the president at the time, Ronald Reagan. And she told him that she had been shot because she was an American and she'd come home and not gotten any kind of support. And she felt incredibly frustrated and upset about that. To her surprise, a few weeks later, the president actually invited her to come and meet with him. And they sat down and had a discussion and talked about the attack that had happened. And he agreed to pay for all of her medical expenses related to the attack for the rest of her life. The following few years were a struggle for Jackie, and her progress was much slower than she would have liked. She was suffering from PTSD and survivor's guilt. And she'd also just gotten married about 3 months before the hijacking, but the whole experience put a huge strain on her marriage, and ultimately it did end in divorce. But Jackie worked hard to regain her independence, and within 3 years, she was actually able to drive and read again. And the result of her head injury that she suffered meant that she actually had trouble recognizing everyday objects, and she experienced extreme learning difficulties that meant that sometimes she would have complete memory blanks. Jackie worked in a special education school, and she said that the more that she learned about her injuries, the more she understood, and she gained a deeper understanding into how the children's minds worked. Unfortunately, work became just too difficult for her because of fatigue and because of her memory issues. And so she actually had to leave her job. But then she started talking about her experience, and she would do keynote speaker speeches and go into universities and places where she could talk about her trauma and how she'd gotten through it. And she actually used this as a way to enhance her life. She went on to say that as a result of the trauma, she has gone on to listen to her inner voice and find peace. In 1998, she gave birth to a baby boy. And even today, in 2022, she still works in public speaking, helping to inspire and motivate others. Obviously, this case is tragic for a number of reasons, but one thing that has been spoken about since and is a huge part of the story is the fact that many people died because of the Egyptian Special Forces unit's raid on the plane. John A. Mitzi writes, quote, "The Egyptian commandos were given too free a hand, and they acted out of their mission with little regard for the safety of the passengers. They were determined to get the hijackers at all costs, and the Maltese government's initial refusal for US anti-terrorist resources offered contributed in no small measure to the mismanagement of the entire operation." There were many horrific things that happened during this hijacking, but one final thing is that a news bulletin on the Maltese national television had stated that all passengers and all crew had been released safely, which obviously wasn't the case. But unfortunately, it gave their families hope, and many of those families that arrived to identify the bodies of their loved ones initially thought they were going to see them alive. I can't imagine being told that my loved one has been through this horrific hijacking ordeal and survived, to get there to realise that actually they've been killed. And in some cases, that was done by the soldiers who were paid to protect them. This is Humans, true stories about the most intriguing parts of human life. The good, the bad, and the downright horrific. My name's Grace. Hello. I am the writer and host of REDRUM True Crime Podcast. If you like true crime and you like podcasts, you might like that. I will leave a link to the podcast in the description box down below, so check that out if you want. Bye.